All right, welcome back, everybody. Here is part two of our early Cold War discussion. First thing on the agenda, Soviets test the atomic bomb. They had been working on theirs right along with us. Our technology was far ahead of theirs, and it was generally felt like the Soviets were well behind. That the Soviets were not going to get the bomb anytime soon. So why do we have this on here? Well, because they tested theirs a heck of a lot earlier than what our intelligence led us to believe. Them testing theirs on August 29th of 1949 was several years ahead of the schedule that we believed they were actually capable of. What that all obviously is going to lead people in the direction of is that, hey, there must be Soviet spies in the United States sharing our secrets. Next, Chinese Revolution, communism in China. Question becomes, well, hey, if we're talking U.S. history, for example, why talk about communism in China? Who cares? Because the whole point to the Cold War is containment. We have to contain communism where it is. We cannot let it spread. If new countries become communist, then containment's not working. So in the late 1940s, a guy by the name of Chiang Kai shek is going to start a communist movement. He's a military leader. He's going to start the communist movement in China. Now, the thing about China is that it's going to happen here very differently from what it does in other countries. In other places, typically what you see is you have the poor, poorer classes will rise up um, against the wealthier classes, and communism will be what they're trying to achieve. In China, Chiang Kai shek actually took the concept of communism to the intellectuals in China, to the elites in China, to the wealthy in China, and his plan was to convince them that it was a good idea to become communist. So he's kind of going to bring it about in a different way. Chiang Kai shek starts the movement. It's going to be this gentleman here, Mao Zedong, that is actually in the early 1950s going to end this movement and become the first actual communist leader in China. Um, Once again, a lot of symbolism here. The red, this would have been a type of propaganda. You would have seen this type of thing all over the place in China. Would have had Mao Zedong and all of these little red books. This was um, something that every good Chinese communist would have had on their person at all times. They would have had it with them. They would have learned from it. They would have studied it. It would have been, the thing that kind of gets everybody in line. The Korean War, man, I wish we had more time. I wish we could talk about, spend more time talking about the Korean War. In our later stages, we're going to talk a little bit about the Vietnam War, but unfortunately, we'll have to leave it to this. So the Korean War is going to be fought, throughout the 1950s, and ultimately, why fight the Korean War? Because containment, once again. You had people in the northern parts of the Korean Peninsula that wanted to become communist and were going to be supported by communists in China and the Soviet Union. You had the southern portion of the Korean Peninsula wanted to become democratic, so they were going to be supported by the United States. Ultimately, when it comes down to, remember the term we used was these proxy wars. The United States is going to be a lot more willing to put our own troops on the ground, and being a part of these actual wars. So Korean War is going to be fought. They're going to fight back and forth, and ultimately, each side decides, you know what, neither side is really going to win or lose this war. So they agree to end the war and create a border between North Korea and South Korea, known as the 38th parallel or 38 degrees latitude. That would be the dividing line between the communist North and the democratic South. The Red Scare. Okay, the Red Scare. We talked about this previously. With the Red Scare, you had a situation where earlier on, it was about, oh my goodness, there's communism that is spreading throughout, Eastern Europe. Oh man, we got to make sure that we keep an eye on this. Well, now that we get to the 1950s, the Red Scare is on our doorstep. It's not if it's going to come here; it's when is it going to get here? What is it going to be here in the United States? So the Red Scare is all these people that were definitely afraid of communism in the United States. So you would have seen all kinds of propaganda. You would have seen posters put up. You saw movies like The Red Menace that was made that was all about communism coming to the United States. Again, more propaganda that you would have seen in grocery stores. You would have seen on the side of buildings. You would have seen in the post office. And it was all about having to be on the lookout for communism in our country. The face of the Red Scare was going to be this guy, Senator Joseph McCarthy from Wisconsin. McCarthyism, as it became known, was this pledge that he was going to go out and that um, he was going to find communists in the United States. He was going to find them, he was going to weed them out, and he was ultimately going to make America safe for safe for democracy. And he was going to rid us of communism. He ultimately, it comes down to it that he has a list of 200 names supposedly, high-ranking officials, politicians, celebrities, actors and actresses, people in Hollywood who were all supposedly communists. He is going to spend an awful lot of money to bring them to trial, and ultimately, of 200 names, 205 names actually. Um, he's going to bring them to trial, and not one is actually going to be convicted. A, he doesn't have any kind of proof, and B, being communist isn't actually against the law. It's not illegal. What is illegal? Falsely accusing people of crimes. So what McCarthy ultimately did led to a whole lot of people being scared and no arrests. And ultimately, what he was doing was a heck of a lot more illegal than anything he accused people of actually doing. Now, this does wind up becoming the face of Soviet espionage in the United States, the Rosenbergs, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. These two were accused of being Soviet spies. Julius supposedly gained information, sensitive information, and Ethel, who spoke Russian, would translate messages, would send messages for him. Ultimately, they were both put on trial. They were convicted and were ultimately executed in the electric chair because of their ties to being Russian spies. Not exactly what most people would think of when they think Russian spies, but this is the face of espionage in America during this time. The Warsaw Pact is a direct result from NATO. Basically, NATO, all the democratic countries get together and form a military alliance. So, with the Warsaw Pact, okay, all the communist countries are going to get together and they're going to form a military alliance. Exactly the same thing as NATO, just the communist side of it. The Eisenhower Doctrine. Now that Eisenhower is president, he's going to take some of the things that have been put out there previously, and he's going to take it a step further. Specifically, he is looking at that Truman Doctrine. Truman Doctrine said, "Hey, Turkey, if you're threatened with communism, we're going to come help you." Eisenhower is going to take that concept and he's going to open it up to the entire Middle East. Anyone in the Middle East feels threatened, we are pledging our support. We will come and help. And finally, the space race. With a lot of different things, a lot of different races, a lot of different competitions are going to make up what is the Cold War. The space race is going to be one of those. Okay, so ultimately, with all these things, for the space race, for example, it's um, who can be the first to fill in the blank. With the space race, it's going to be anything with regards to getting to outer space, to putting satellites out there, to putting a man into orbit, to putting a man on the moon. It's all a big competition between the United States and the Soviets. Who can do it first? Sputnik is going to be the first satellite put into outer space. It is going to be Soviets. Didn't really do a whole heck of a lot, but because they're the first ones to do it, they're the ones that are actually going to be remembered for it. There actually is a model of this. There is a life-sized replica of Sputnik in the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. If you ever get a chance, highly recommend checking out the Air Force Museum out there in Dayton.